Popeye the Sailor, 90 years old and still strong to the finish. And there's a reason for that. Popeye is a complicated sailor, a miraculous adventurer in a series full of fun-filled action and witty humor, with a supporting cast that's lovable, if uncouth, while also featuring a lot of sensibilities from decades past that don't look so good today, for a good reason. There's a lot to say about Popeye, good and bad, and if you ever got a true revival or a movie, we'd hope they'd focus on what shines. Like the fact that he saved the spinach industry. And in honor of his 90th, Animated Minds is going to talk about something specific. The fights. There's more to Popeye than fights, but the end of every cartoon, they were all over the comic and everybody remembers them, either for the animation or the endless sight gags or whatever you loved about him. And like an anime channel, we're going to list our top 5 plus a few honorable mentions. But that's all the talking about it we can stands. We can't stands no more. Let's get going. Number 5. The boxing match from Popeye the movie. For this list, I wanted to go all across Popeye's history, and the movie is a pretty good place to start. This 1980 adaptation by Paramount and Walt Disney Studios, if you can believe it, tried to adapt both the settings and the characters from the comic strip, which we'll get into later, and some general cues from the film shorts, which we'll definitely get into later. When you think about a fight from this movie, you're probably going to think about the one at the end with Bluto, with the giant octopus and the giant fists coming out of the water, and Bluto literally turning yellow and running away. But I've personally always thought that this fight encapsulates the spirit and the humor of the character a little better than that one. Popeye, after all, isn't just about punching things, it's about inserting humor around the fact that the characters are always punching things. Here you get some of Popeye's trademark asides, lots of silly ways that the two trade blows, and even gets into a fight with the guy's mother, which is really funny. And it showcases something that a lot of people forget about Popeye, but which is going to come up a couple more times in this list, the fact that he's plenty tough without spinach. The fight ends with the guy just wailing on him, and Popeye sits there, tanks it, and finishes him off with his trademark Twisker punch, which is another thing we're going to see a few more times. It's a very fun scene straight out of a comic strip, and it earns its place at number 5. Number 4. Organ Grinders Swing. Basically the whole thing. This is a Fleischer Studios cartoon. Popeye, of course, has a long film history, but when it comes to the major studios who produced Popeye cartoons, you're usually talking about Fleischer Studios or Famous Studios. We're going to get into Famous Studios a bit later, but for the most part, on this list, you're going to hear about Fleischer, and for good reason. Fleischer were masters at motion, making things fluid and expressive and vibrant and full of spectacle. You could see this also in Betty Boop, which was all about music and characters moving to music. And between Betty Boop and Popeye, you had some of the best character animation of the golden age of Hollywood. But getting on to the example itself. 1937's Organ Grinders Swing features Popeye versus Bluto over a street musician who's just trying to make a living. The musician is wimpy, literally, but we won't hold that against him. And unlike a lot of other cartoons where there is a small fight at first and a big fight later, this one is almost literally just one big fight, and everybody gets involved. Popeye, Bluto, Olive Oil, the organ grinder, the monkey. The fight goes up the building, down the building, in the building, out the building, everywhere. It's crazy. And it's a delight to watch the whole block just converge on Bluto to give him his just desserts. It's a great full episode example of how vibrant and full of impact Fleischer's style was. You can feel those hits and it just makes the whole thing pop. Organ Grinders Swing is a number 4. Number 3. Painless Window Washers. Now, if Organ Grinders Swing is on this list for being a full episode that shows off the best of Fleischer Studios' style, this episode is on here for having one of the best single sequences ever in a Popeye cartoon. I mean, this is really cool. This 1937 short features Bluto as a crooked window washer who has a problem when Olive Oil chooses Popeye to do her windows instead. a violent problem, knowing Bluto. Actually, the whole of this episode is very fun, with a lot of smart animation techniques and perspective gags as Popeye and Bluto show off on the side of the building. But we're here to talk about the fight. There's a lot of fun humor as Popeye and Bluto literally fight up the building, but the real meat of it is, of course, after Popeye eats the spinach. This final sequence is only about a half a minute long, and it is fantastic. It's very action-packed, the kind of rapid-fire punching you would see in an anime nowadays, but of course several decades ahead. And instead of that animation just being an easily repeated bit of filler, it's very developed. Each motion that Popeye makes is intentional and well represented, no matter what he's doing, which is surprising for the kind of action that we're seeing here, which is why it's such a great sequence. It's extremely well animated as Popeye knocks Bluto around, side to side, up the building, down the building, and back where he came from. You might even argue this whole video is just an excuse for me to show this to you. I love this sequence. Painless Window Washers comes in at number 3. Number 2. Popeye vs. Bluto, the Popeye comic. Popeye's history is not really something that surprises people as much as it used to, but in case you didn't know, Popeye started out as a comic book character in a series called Thimble Theater before his popularity took over the strip, and it became the Popeye comic, which eventually led to the cartoon series. And you're actually less likely to find full fights in the comic than in the cartoons. People are punchy alright, but the Popeye comic is more like Tintin or the Duck comics. It's more adventures, but instead of solving problems with their wits, the characters solve those problems by punching each other in the face. If you're an adventure fan, you're gonna love it, but it doesn't exactly give us much for this list, with one big exception. Bluto, when he first appeared in 1933, was just a random villain who wanted to beat up Popeye on a boat. That's it. The roughest tough around, but nothing huge in terms of Popeye villains at the time. But what makes him stand out is the sheer extent to which they fought. Like I said, the fighting in the Popeye series is mostly for gags, so something like this? They fought for 2 weeks of daily comic strips. The art slowly gets rougher and rougher as they slowly get more and more injured by their fight. By the end of it, they're practically 2 blobs wailing at each other, until Popeye finishes Bluto off with his signature Twisker punch, which we'll see again in a little bit. This is on here not just because of how different it is from the series that surrounded it, nor solely for how impressive it is. Remember, this was a 2-week-long story, but also because of how historic it was. This was Bluto's first appearance ever, and he made a heck of an impression. Enough that he was picked as the villain of the Popeye series not long after, and the rest is history. Popeye vs. Bluto in the comic gets number 2. Honorable mention. So there are a couple of smaller moments I thought about putting on here, like the really silly and fun paintbrush fight in My Artistical Temperature, or back to the cool perspective stuff, the fight on the wire in Hold That Wire. But instead, I dedicated this whole segment to a character who rarely gets their chance to shine, has also been around longer than Popeye himself. That's right, Olive. Now in the comics, Olive was something of the Captain Haddock to Popeye's Tintin. The cynic to his idealist, she was often right by his side when he was going on adventures, and she had a pretty mean right hook. In the earlier Fleischer shorts, you saw that too, with an Olive who was more involved in the series' roughhousing, and generally just had a bit more variety in how she could be used, both in adventures and in slice of life. But, as we all know, eventually the damsel in distress angle took over pretty much the entire series. I'm a big fan of Popeye in most respects, but I'm not going to deny that the series got pretty chauvinist. And by the famous studios days, that was typically all the use that Olive got. But here we'll be looking at the 2 big moments from the shorts where Olive ate the spinach and saved the day. Hillbilling and Cooing from Famous Studios and Never Kick a Woman from Fleischer Studios. The reason there isn't more famous studios on this list is because by then the cartoons were a bit more about the humor and the sight gags than the action. When fighting a villain, it was mostly just pow, somebody goes flying into something, and then a joke. And Hillbilling and Cooing is no exception. Popeye has been kidnapped by a wild woman who wants to make him marry her, and when Olive eats the spinach, she basically just throws her up, she flies into space, and hits the moon. Meanwhile, the Fleischer Studio short, Never Kick a Woman, involves Olive going up against a bodybuilder who wants Popeye's attention while he's supposed to be teaching her self-defense. This one is framed as a cat fight, which isn't great, but the way it's animated is. They take into account the fact that Olive has a very unique design. You know, she's a noodle person. So they have her loop around punches and use herself as a helicopter. It's really a fun fight, even though it's pretty short. And she ends up fighting Popeye too, which is pretty funny and unexpected. Here's hoping we see a little bit more of that Olive in future Popeye stuff. Number 1. Popeye meets Sinbad the Sailor. Let's face it, every Popeye fan watching this video probably knew this was coming from the moment they started. Popeye meets Sinbad the Sailor is not just one of the greatest Popeye cartoons ever made, it's one of the greatest cartoons ever made, period. It's visually spectacular, got musical numbers a delight to see in motion, and it still holds up to this day. But we're here about the fight. And what makes the fight against Sinbad, here a villain played by Bluto, so spectacular is the build-up. Like our number 5 example, this is another piece of media that shows off just how tough Popeye is even without spinach. This cartoon sees Popeye turning a giant rock into roast chicken, and besting a giant in a fight that could almost make this list itself. Sinbad sends them all after him, and each one falls one at a time, leading up to the big fight, the final boss. You know what it is.
We're gonna come to terms right now.
It's rare that one of these cartoons really sells not just Popeye's strength, but the strength of the guy outclassing him so well. It really makes the whole thing surprisingly tense. And the fight itself is beautifully animated and full of great details. The details are really where animation shines, and I love these little things. For example, there's a really fun quick moment where Sinbad tries to sucker punch Popeye with a rock, and Popeye just punches it back like tennis. One of those little things that really makes the fight pace so well. And of course, it all ends with a little spinach, the signature theme, Popeye delivering a well-deserved beatdown, and in a rarity for the shorts, his signature Twisker punch. An amazing short and a culmination of everything that came before it, Popeye Meets Sinbad the Sailor is a great cartoon, and hits number 1 on our list of greatest fights in the series. The most remarkable, extraordinary battle. And that's our list. Pretty punchy, but then again, Popeye is one tough gazookas. Like I said, there's a lot more to love about Popeye than just the fights, but this was a big part of him and lots of fun to think about. Were there any fights from the series that you liked that we didn't mention? Well, follow us and let us know, and we'll see what our animated minds come up with next. Till then, happy anniversary, Popeye. 90 years and more, and still our favorite sailor.